Before presenting our guests properly, I just wanted to say that the panel will, the main topic of the panel is John Giorno and this exhibition and of course John Giorno life. For almost half a century, John Giorno was a leading cultural figure in New York. John Giorno was a poet, an activist, a performer, a visual artist, and is the first solo exhibition of the artist in Asia. Now I'd like to present our two guests for today. Yuan Fuca is a curator, writer, and Cadist Associate Program Director for China. She's a curatorial fellow supported by the Ying Foundation, where she researches artist travel. Previously, she served as Artistic Director at the recently launched Macalin Art Center in Beijing. From 2016 to 2019, she led and managed Sold Projects in Beijing, a non-profit art space that offered a site for action and exchange among young artists and practitioners. She also had curated and co-curated group exhibition and projects, as well as solo exhibition. Yuan Fuca is the founding editor of Hechi magazine, and her writing has been published on platforms such as Art Forum, Art News, BOM, Flash Art, and Fritz. Thank you for joining us today. Anthony Huberman is the newly appointed Executive Director of the John Giorno Foundation, the New York-based organization dedicated to the preservation and promotion of John Giorno's work. He also serves as Artistic Director of its venue, The Bunker, in New York. Previously, Anthony was the former Director and Chef Curator at CCA Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco since 2013. Before coming to CCA Wattis, Anthony in 2010 founded the Artists Institute at Hunter College in New York. He previously served as Chef Curator at the Contemporary Art Museum Saint Louis and as Curator at Paris Palais Tokyo and New York Sculpture Center. Earlier, he was Director of Education and Public Program at BOMA PS1. He has published numerous articles in art periodicals, including Art Forum, After Ali, Moose, and ... So to start with, I would like to start with an anecdote. So in 1963, John Giorno celebrated his birthday in New York, and he was surrounded by the most impressive artists of his time. Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Mercy Cunningham, Ed Ruscha, Roy Lichtenstein, John Cage, among many others. Giorno was a key figure of the New York underground. He was a muse, a lover to other artists. Today, only a few people know about his extraordinary life. My question is, how did this kid from Brooklyn become the figure of the New York underground from the 60s and 70s? And how did his meeting with one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, Andy Warhol, played a major role in his career?
He certainly had an incredible life and was surrounded by an amazing community. I think a couple, that made a huge impact, his relationship with that community that you named. There's a couple of things to say. One is that back then, the New York art community was much, much smaller. And, a lot of, the artists, poets, musicians, filmmakers, dancers, all hung out at the same bars and restaurants and kind of bumped into each other and talked to each other and spent time with each other. And there was a huge amount of cross-fertilization during that period in New York. So inevitably, communities form in that way. Conversations begin across disciplines. So he, as you said, was a poet, or identified himself as a poet, but he found himself socially and relationships and community-wise spending time with artists and musicians and choreographers. And Andy Warhol is someone that he met very early on, in the early 1960s. Actually, they met on the occasion of Warhol's first ever exhibition in New York, and they became lovers. And And so, you know, John found himself going to all of these events and parties and meeting everyone, because Warhol certainly was circulating in a lot of different social contexts. And so John was there. He was just present during all of these. And that particular meeting was impactful for a bunch of different reasons. One, Warhol in the mid-60s, in 1964, famously, you know, he said publicly that he didn't want to make paintings anymore, that he wanted to make films. And of course he continued making paintings, but he did start making films, which became very well known. But the very first one that he made was a film called Sleep, which just consisted of a man sleeping for 5 hours. And that man was John Giorno. And so in this strange way, John became this notorious figure as being Andy Warhol's muse, Andy Warhol's star, Andy Warhol's protagonist. And so I think that kind of catapulted him in a strange way into the community, into the limelight in that sense. But I think another really important relationship that he had in those years, towards after his relationship with Warhol, he started to become very close to the artist Robert Rauschenberg, and they also became lovers with Robert Rauschenberg. And Robert Rauschenberg at the time was doing things, experimenting in many different ways. You know, he began his career mostly again as a painter, and he too was interested in experimenting and expanding his practice beyond painting. And he started experimenting with a group called Experiments in Art and Technology, which was a kind of collective that put artists together with engineers and scientists, so that there was a certain expertise that engineers could bring to the conversation, that artists weren't trained in engineers. They didn't know how to use machines. They didn't know how to use early computer technology. And so they had these collaborations. And so John was able to observe all of these painters starting to do things like big interactive art installations that involved technology, and was just impressed with how the visual art world seemed to be able to expand past its own boundaries, its own traditions. And so he asked himself, inspired by that, he asked himself, well, what about poets? You know, why are poets still stuck in the context of the printed page? You know, I'm seeing all these painters go outside of the canvas as their medium and do performances and do video and do all these other things, then what about why can't poetry also experiment with going outside of its traditional context of the book or the magazine? And so for him, that was a very, very important early experience and inspiration that led him to a lot of his own work of taking poetry off of the printed page and into performance and into technology like the telephone, and then ultimately later on into painting.
With what you just said, actually, I'll bring to the second question. The title of the exhibition is I Am a Poet. And John Giorno was always describing himself as a poet. And back then, as you said, like poetry was kind of out of date, and he was saying like other medium, like painting or music, being much more like cool and much more innovative. And by using, and it transformed it by using technology and other media, which led to what you described slightly just earlier, to his most iconic work, Dollar Poem, in 1968. Maybe can you elaborate more about his love and relationship to poetry, but also like Dollar Poem as well, and explain what is Dollar Poem and what impact it has been for the art world back then.
So Dial a Poem began, again, coming from this reflection of trying to situate poetry elsewhere, off of the printed page. And also to try to democratize poetry, try to make it a little bit more part of everyday life, and not just in the world of poetry readings in coffee houses, but to make it something that is much more regular, much more everyday. And so it occurred to him that inserting you rather than a book that you read, that maybe the telephone, which is not only a piece of technology but is very much part of an object that people use every day, that maybe the voice on the other line of a phone call did not necessarily have to just be, the voice of your friend inviting you to dinner or the voice of someone telling you something, but could be the voice of a poet reading you a poem. And so he thought that the phone might be a good venue for poetry. So he had an opportunity in 1968 at an organization called the Architectural League of New York, doing an exhibition. And so he bought a series of phones, and he got these kind of industrial size answering machines. And again, he worked with engineers to help him connect this in such a way and create the technology that's necessary to have this system work. And he set up a local phone number in New York that anyone could call. And when you called it, it would trigger a mechanism that would make one of those answering machines start. And on the answering machine, he reached out to his community again, the other poets and artists and musicians that he was in conversation with, and he said, "Would you like to contribute to my new poetry venue?" And so he recorded them reading a poem, and so when you called, you would get the mechanism was set up in such a way that a random recording would go when you called. And then if you hung up and called again, you would get one of the random poets. In the beginning, the very first version, there were 22 poets that he invited, poets and musicians and artists that he invited. And then he did it. That exhibition led to an invitation to be part of what was a seminal, very important, art historically important exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art 2 years later in 1970 called Information, which was a kind of landmark exhibition in the history of conceptual art. And the curator of Information invited John and invited him to redo Dial a Poem again, and this time at MoMA. And so, of course, at MoMA, it's much, much more visible, a lot of press, and a huge thousands and thousands and thousands of calls every day coming into the number. And when he did it in 1970, he added more. So it went from 22 to more. And then over the years, he just kept inviting more of his peers to contribute. And so the amount of poems on the phone kept going up and up and up. And the exhibition, the sculpture that we have in the exhibition here is the very last version that he made before he passed away in early 2019. And this one is the most comprehensive. It has almost 200 poets on there. So I encourage everyone after the talk to pick up the phone, dial a number, and you'll see who you get. Maybe you get Patti Smith, maybe you get Allen Ginsberg, maybe you get William Burroughs, maybe, who knows?
It's also, I think like the mechanism of the, dialogue poem is also aligned with like, what's happening in the performance scene, like happenings, just kind of like, it's like all by chance in a way. So it's kind of really aligned with like what was happening in not just the visual arts, but like performance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the chance part is really important to him. It was really important to him that it's not that you pick up the phone and you can press 2 for Patti Smith. You can't choose. It's all about the kind of miracle of this thing, this poem just being read to you, and you don't know who and what.
Yeah, and also if you knew already, like the list, your brand, because you like Patti Smith, will always like press Patti Smith. So at least when it's random, you have what you get. Yeah. So I think that's also part of it. And poetry has a long history in the West and East. And also I wanted to, because it's the first exhibition of John Giorno in Asia, how do you think the local audience will react to his work? And also like how we could like insert or relate John Giorno's work to maybe like, poetry here or even the art of calligraphy? Because see like, the wording as a very important aspect here, even in paintings, for instance. So how will you put John Giorno's work into that?
Mm. I was thinking about this like yesterday, and one kind of a counter figure called Wu Shanzhuan, from the like 85 like art movements like in China. He's kind of like having a similar style. I think one of his first installation was kind of utilizing all this like Cultural Revolution poster style, and then like kind of like in taking out all this like ideological like heavy text, and then made them into like something like out of context. And then he also made a lots of oil paintings later, kind of like also poetry, like in the form of poetry. So yeah, I think there's definitely also Wu Shanzhuan, or that kind of generation from the late 80s. They were really heavily influenced by Rauschenberg, because Rauschenberg had an exhibition in Beijing in 1989, and so had a huge influence on like the avant-garde artists. And actually, UCCA did a retrospective of that Rauschenberg in Beijing back then, a couple of years ago. So I feel there's like, kind of like lots of like dots can be connected. Yeah. But in terms of poetry, I guess, well, like Chinese poetry has like a really crazy long history, and also the literati tradition behind it. So there's always like an urge, through poetry talking about politics, or like this kind of discomfort with reality. But then like I guess like the Misty poetry or Misty poem, which is kind of really influential after the Cultural Revolution, kind of like in the 80s. And they're kind of trying to also see how to blur these boundaries between verbal and visual, like how to kind of like trying to, there's representation of like a poetic imagery and into like more visual forms.
So is there a history of poets who take on a visual, trying to figure out how can they represent poetry off the printed page in the same way and bring it into painting or bring it into performance? Or
yeah, I think definitely, because even like in like early 20th century, it's like it's a pound and all this like image, like just like a English literature influence and in China. And then like there's, I think, yeah, that's been like a while, but I guess like it's more like prominent, like it's probably with like Wu Shanzhuan's approach, and also like within like this also a very small circle of like avant-garde like art history in China in the 90s, like where most of the events are happening in like diplomatic compound or like small gatherings.
yeah, I mean, for John took poetry not only onto the telephone, but I think most predominantly the main space that he was interested in occupying was performance as a form and as a language. And what happens when a word goes from being written and read to being heard, right? And how can the voice play a role into kind of doing something with language that the written word doesn't do? And so how can you perform a word rather than how can you just write or read a word? And that became really important aspect of his practice. And he would, not only would he do a traditional poetry reading, but how he would pronounce would be a very predominant and important part, and very specific to John. People can recognize the way in which he would say some words very loud and play with repetition. But then later on, he toured the country playing not just in poetry reading context, but in rock clubs. And he would have a band with him, and he would be playing using the format, again, the venue of the rock club as a way to deliver his poetry, because he recognized that it was inherently more fun.
But as you said as well, like a lot of his poems actually are visual poems because when you read them, it's not the same impact as actually when you see them being performed by him, like his gesture, his voice on stage. Either it's just a classic performance or like using a rock band as well. And I encourage everyone to actually see him perform because it's very something to absolutely see, and you will understand even better his practice.
Yeah, there's a lot on YouTube you can see of him performing. And then the painting, you know, comes out of that as well. Again, it's another venue. He really thought of that word, that he really thought of these different contexts or medium or platforms as a venue. If the traditional venue for poetry was the magazine or the book, then he really wanted to stretch that and break that down and bring it to the telephone, bring it to the rock club, bring it to t-shirts, you know, bring it to consumer products like matchbooks and, you know, and then of course, ultimately bring it to painting, which then provides him another way of being able to do something with words, you know, to be able to play with scale, to be able to play with repetition. And I think that's something that evolved over the years.
And like what you describe as well by like giving back to the community brings me to like the next question about the importance of Buddhism in his practice and even in his life. There was a beautiful press release written by Neil Zhang and really described this relationship between his arts, poetry, and Buddhism, which I also recommend to read on our website or at the front desk. You can take a copy. And there is a concept called dana in Buddhism, which can be translated by the art of giving. And John Giorno has always been giving back to the community, trying to, at 222 Bovary, his studio, to always like, it was a space for meditation, but also a space for creativity, inviting artists to come over. He was always collaborating with other artists, always trying to democratize the access to poetry. Maybe when you can elaborate a bit more about this component of Buddhism in his art and how much influence he has on his work and his life.
A huge influence. I mean, Buddhism was incredibly central to what he did every day. You know, he was an incredibly committed practitioner who was very close with his teachers. He first went to India to meet with and study with Buddhist teachers in 1971. So pretty early on in terms of, you know, the United States, or maybe New York in particular, has a long history of the art community learning from Buddhism and Buddhist teachers. But this was definitely on the early side of that happening. And he's actually going to what you said. He put a lot of thought and energy into not only learning himself, but in helping those teachers come to the United States, and so that they could come and provide those teachings to his community or anyone in New York. And he helped them set up a place in Manhattan where they could do teachings. And it was very important to him. And I think that it comes across in a couple different ways that in his artwork. In terms of his performance and poetry, I think that the connection to repetition, of it being something that's very much, you know, linked to a mantra or a meditation practice of kind of over and over and over again, is something that is I think connected or to his life as a Buddhist. And then I think also the phrases themselves, as we see here, I think speak to a kind of equivalence made, a kind of judgmentless, you know, kind of a letting go of any judgment being made about, you know, oh, I wish that my life was only about shining and never burning. You know, burning is bad, shining is good. And this kind of phrase, this kind of neutralizes that argument and kind of acknowledges that, both are the case. Both are part of what it means to be human. And it's not about holding on to hopes of having one and avoiding having the other. And it's more about embracing the fact that we all are connected to both of those forces, are part of everyone's life. So I feel like that's also emerges out of Buddhism. I don't know if you agree.
Well, I'm not a Buddhism scholar, but also when even in his Columbia years, when he was a student from I think 1955, around that time, Buddhism or he studied comparative literature and also read a lot in Oriental literature. Exposed to this Buddhism philosophies, and also what's happened in Tibet was also had a really huge impact on him. And I remember from his memoir, he was kind of having this longing to go to Tibet already, and thinking why he wasn't born there originally anyways. So he has this kind of really romantic imagination of this land. And I feel like it's also because Tantra Buddhism was kind of relatively new in that time, and it's in relationship to his very quick expression about a gay eroticism. Eroticism is very connected, how he's very comfortable openly being gay and talk about sex and love and extra.
And Buddhism, right? He kind of he rejected that those two things somehow could be separated. Exactly. Yeah, he saw zero problem with that. Someone could be very involved in both. Yeah, I think that's a really important part. Yeah. He's still today, I mean, it's still ongoing. He, as you mentioned, one of his, he lived in the same building from 1966 all the way until he died. And he lived in a building on the Bowery, 222 Bowery, which was an incredible building with an incredible history of other artists also living in that building. The French painter Fernand Léger had his studio there. The painter Mark Rothko had his studio there. The artist Linda Benglis had her studios there, still has a studio there. And William Burroughs lived there. And John lived there, and he was very close to William Burroughs. And when William Burroughs passed away in the late 1990s, John was able to acquire Burroughs's loft, and he was very close to a particular monastery up north in upstate New York, a few hours north of the city. And he went there regularly and was very close to the people there. And he went there and he said, hey, it would be so helpful, I think, if rather than expecting, people are going to find it hard to go 2 hours north to have access to the Buddhist teachers here, would you be willing, at least maybe once a month, to come down to New York City, and so that these teachers can be made available to the community in New York? And if you do that, I will give you the keys to this loft that I have on the Bowery. And that agreement essentially began in 1986 and continues right now, still now. So every once a month, on the second Saturday of every month, the teachers come down and they have an open to anyone day-long retreat that still happens on the Bowery today.
Yeah, that's quite crazy to hear that story. To conclude, because it's almost done, and before we ask the audience if they have any questions for our guest, and thank you both again, I would like to touch upon the instrumental role of the foundation and its role today, and also, Anthony, your role within the foundation, and its impact on poetry as an art form today, and maybe more as well on a more global scale. How do you see poetry evolving from Giorno to today? If it's still, because the idea of John Giorno was to basically, to make it simple, make it like a cool thing, And you think it's like cool poetry today, or like it's still seen as like this boring art form? And I would like to hear your thoughts.
In the memoir,
Exactly.
famously calls it boring.
But even I think when I was asking Patti Smith, just like, how can I become famous poet? So like, just like create a rock band, and that will make you famous.
Yeah, yeah. Where is poetry at?
Yeah,
Wow.
it's a big question. Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about this yesterday. I do feel like there's a potential for AI poetry,
For
artificial intelligence poetry, but I guess I think one of the like really appealing point for like Giorno's work and also, it's really just like the community and that space you create and like the New York poetry, like poetic circle is definitely have that kind of sense, like like a community, and I feel like it doesn't have to be like really talking about like where poetry is gonna go, but like how you kind of keep building that kind of community space for sharing, and then like and later might become like another kind of legacy in a way. So
I think, I mean, for me, John represents this glue that then can connect artists, poets, and musicians to each other so they can talk to each other, learn from each other, work with each other. And he really was the kind of gatherer of those different fields that sometimes have a way of migrating in different places. There's the artists who are doing things in museums and galleries, and the musicians who are doing things in nightclubs and concert halls, and the poets who are doing things on a stage. And John really ignored those lines and really worked very hard to try to bring those communities together. And to speak to your question about the foundation, that really is the purpose of it. So John created back in 1965 a nonprofit organization called Giorno Poetry Systems, GPS, which had as a mission, well, it's evolved over the years. It really began more poetry focused in terms of trying to, again, take poetry off the printed page. But it ultimately evolved into a mechanism that he had and he wanted to use to support others, to support his peers, to support the work of artists, poets, and musicians. And he did that in many ways. He supported poets, of course, by inviting them to contribute to the Dial-A-Poem project, for example, to make sure that their voice and their work was made visible on this new platform. GPS also started a record label in the 1980s and as a way to support musicians, and he made almost 60 records with different musicians that are in distribution still now, as his way to try to, again, to connect different audiences to the work of different musicians. Then he started a grant program, and he started writing small grants to artists and poets who at the time were dealing with, it was mostly focused on health concerns, artists that didn't have health insurance that would need help with those, he would provide grants. So GPS became this kind of early version of a kind of artist mutual aid project where it really was trying, he was an artist and poet and musician, and he tried to kind of use this organization that he created as a way to support the work of other artists, musicians, and poets. So I think that's so the work of the foundation is going to be to kind of build on that legacy and build on that mission of artists, poets, and musicians that are in some way reflecting on or sharing with an audience their interest in or their perspective on the work of other artists, musicians, and poets. And so the GPS has a range of different ways to do that. There's an event program at 222 Bowery, lectures, screenings, concerts. Again, all artists, poets, and musicians who are inviting other artists, poets, and musicians to present their work. We're going to restart the record label, a new series of records, restart the grant program. And then, of course, we're also working on expanding and doing international versions of Dial-A-Poem. One thing, and actually John had wanted to do and did a few small versions of this when he was alive, but he always very much had expressed that he really felt very strongly about wanting to do this, which would be to do dial-a-poem Korea, dial-a-poem Germany, dial-a-poem Norway, dial-a-poem India, where it would be you would go to Korea and you would set up a local Korean phone number, and then you would invite a new generation of poets and musicians and artists who not only are just Korean, but more importantly are writing in Korean. And then you would record those, and then those would be the ones that would be put on the phone number. So not only was it a way to make visible and support the work of a new generation of poets, younger people, but of course it was also a way to not just prioritize the English language, and to have these different dial-a-poems that would, again, get the spoken word in all languages much more out in the world. And so we're working on trying to make a lot of more of those dial-a-poem versions.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Yuan.